This is the Singapore model, what the U.S. can learn. It's by Daniel O'Neill for Aspen University, 7/4/2016. It's prepared for capstone class 799, and the class is taught by Professor Lance Spivey. Alright, why do we need to study Singapore or any other place for that matter? First off, our criminal justice system is floundering a little bit. Our jails aren't particularly good. We don't particularly rehab many people. There's gangs, there's violence. Murder rate is still pretty high. An entire segment of our population ends up in jail. Now, there's been lots of proposals, magic bullets about how to make a dent in this population and how to reform the system. But by and large, they come, they go. They don't make that much of a difference. The cost of our criminal justice system, particularly our jail system, is exorbitant. It's one of the highest in the world, if not the highest. It becomes its own little social welfare system. And another thing with the policing of this country, whole sections of this country, it says, are outside the rule of the law. The author can verify that around his neighborhood or his city of Philadelphia. There's Camden, New Jersey, Chester, PA, Wilmington, Delaware, and they are very much outside the rule of law. They talk about no-go zones in different countries. Well, they're pretty close to no-go zones in this country. Alright, there's some benefits to studying systems outside our own. For one, you get some new ideas. You also learn to discard some ideas. You know, we use programs in this country. Another country's experience may be that they're junk. You know, they talk about evidence-based programming. Well, there can be evidence-based against using a program, and that's what we may find. Some countries adapt our own systems, and maybe they're doing them a little better. Maybe they got some wrinkles, so that's important to know. And we avoid a knowledge vacuum. Just, doing what you do and not learning from the rest of the world can leave you falling behind at times, and we don't want that to happen. Alright, in preparing for the capstone, I read a great deal of literature, studied a great deal. I watched some YouTube videos, seen some lectures from Singapore, and what have I found? Singapore made great progress in fighting crime. Now, it's known as a safe island at this point, island nation. But it had its problems before, and it had a drug problem. In about 1969, Lee Kuan Yew started cracking a whip there. And that's where they turned it around to really become a safe place. The country has made a huge investment in rehabilitation and reintegration. Once again, they're known, the popular media focuses on their caning of criminals like Michael Fay and executions of drug dealers from other countries. But they've made a huge investment in this Yellow Ribbon Project, where they make sure that the ex-offenders get jobs and various other things. They have a SCORE program. It's a rehabilitation arm of the government, and it works. Apparently it does anyway. The system is commendable for efficiency and rationality. Now, that doesn't just include the criminal justice system. Their government is very much let's say, a practical government. They look at what works, what doesn't. They discard stuff. And that causes some problems with the outside world, too, because once again, they're very cold and calculated in decision making. And their criminal justice system maintains a strong commitment to punishment and community protection. Even in spite of their rehabilitation, they say their number one goal is punishment and accountability for the offender and community protection. I know in the United States, especially with juveniles, they sort of go against that. Their rehabilitation is more important than the community protection angle. We run into some problems with that. Not all the time, but that's a problematic factor in juvenile justice here. Okay, juvenile justice is a priority. Now it says rehab is the stated goal. Yes, that's a little different than the adults. They're a little less harsh. They try to get the kids in education systems or in rehab. They have a juvenile prison school, and the schooling is pretty much on par with what is available outside the prison juvenile justice system. So that's a good thing. They also involve the families. They have family conferencing, which they developed off the Maori model from New Zealand, and it gets the family involved in making the community and whole, and the victim too. It's very important to be aware of the victim. They are a multicultural system, a little different than ours. They aren't necessarily a melting pot. They recognize distinct separation of the races. Now, they're allowed to melt into the pot if they want, so to speak, but they recognize that there's groups that are a little different, and they even have a different legal system for the Muslims, which we'll go over in our main report. Now, there's plenty of dissenting opinions on Singapore, as you can imagine. Any country that's harsh will get some people who aren't pleased, and that's what it is. They're still draconian in punishment. They're a little harsh. They still cane people. They still execute people, as does the United States. The multiculturalism that I mentioned, they don't think it treats everybody fairly. The main immigrant group is the Chinese, and they do pretty well there. But people think it's at the expense of the Malays and Indians. The Indians tend to do second best as Indians from India, and Malaysians tend to be at the bottom of the social structure, and they believe that's a form of discrimination that keeps them there. Yeah, the rehabilitation options are more limited for minorities. The Chinese population is dominant in Singapore, as I mentioned, and they are also very wealthy. They have more social capital, they say. They have more businesses. They have better education opportunities. So the feeling is that in the rehabilitation ring, if people turn to their own people, the Chinese ex-offender would have more opportunity than the Indian or Malay. The Malays tend not to be as economically strong, so that's a negative in the rehabilitation effort. The death penalty is used on poor criminals. Well, that's a argument in this country too. And there's been some studies that a lot of the criminals put to death were simple drug carriers, and the kingpins got off, and maybe the Chinese lords who ran the drug rings were getting off. And they've recently changed the laws to give the court more discretion on hitting the low-level drug dealers. It's not an instant death penalty like it used to be. Corporal punishment is still allowed in the home, schools, and institutions. So even though it's very much limited for juveniles in a prison environment or a juvenile detention center, they can't get 16 or 17. It has to be ordered by an adult adult court judge. They are still corporal punishment can be administered in schools and things like that. So it's pretty much died out in America, but it is definitely present in Singapore. And the country, they believe, is weak in protection of citizens' civil rights. Civil liberties, as in this country, don't really exist. They do recognize some, but not to the extent that a citizen would get away with something based on a right. They don't tend to have that comportment to their law. Now, how did the author perform his evaluation? Well, basically, it was extensive review of material from both supporting and dissenting sources. It wasn't like I went to Singapore and checked it out, so I was relying on a lot of secondhand sources. They're good sources. It's a lot of researchers do that, but it isn't first-hand knowledge. Examine the government's documents. Now, of course, the government's going to be put a positive spin on most stuff, but they have to be honest with their crime rates and their execution rates, and they're up for a little scrutiny. So that was a good source. The studied in comparisons of international crime rate. Singapore does very well, very well. Some of the Asian countries like Japan and, well, Hong Kong's not a country, but a protectorate or part of China, it does well. But those aren't multicultural nations. Singapore has nations, and you compare the Malay crime rate with what it is in Malaysia or the Indian and with India, and you can see Singapore is much lower in their country. Recidivism, incarceration, rehabilitation rates were examined. We looked at them faithfully and seen what they were doing. And Singapore, in some places, recidivism is like 20%. Well, it's a little high, much higher in the United States, and so they're doing something right, or their people are different, or their culture is different. But that's one. To make a study like that, you have to look at all the variables. Now, largely qualitative analysis performed on the research data. You're getting a lot of data from social scientists, professors, scholars, so they tend to be qualitative in their opinions. And the quantitative analysis comes from you analyze crime rates versus international versus different countries, recidivism rates, costs associated with the system, and you compare that to countries around the world. Yeah, you got to be careful because of countries all have different situations. The one thing about Singapore that makes it somewhat applicable to the United States is that it is multicultural. The Malays, are a minority in the country. The Indians are considered, less economically advantaged than the Chinese. So they have some things that are just like our country. So that makes it helpful to perform a comparison. Alright, you make some discoveries as a student during the course of your investigation. What did I find? Singapore has created a relatively crime-free society. Did not know its crime was that rate. The cost of this, though, may be unacceptable elsewhere. The cost in civil liberties, not so much the cost and expense, but civil liberties, multiculturalism, separation of races, things like that might not be appropriate to the United States. And that's taken up in the next point. Singapore has been dealing with multicultural reality that many countries are just beginning to face. The United States, as it increases its immigrant population, the Hispanic projected to take over the majority position in the country, and that may harbor some changes in how things are done. Singapore's commitment to assured, rapid, harsh justice appears to be effective. It does appear to be effective there. Now, a lot of people will say that deterrence doesn't work and, the research doesn't hold it out, but if you look at it operantly, it does appear to be effective for Singapore. Once again, you got to be aware that sometimes it's just for a particular place that it works. Singapore holds the rule of law concept very important. It's paramount in how they judge their criminal justice system. They believe that in order comes freedom. Other countries pay lip service to this concept, but they don't actually enforce it. For instance, I mentioned earlier there's plenty of places in this country where the rule of law does not exist, and that it does not exist. That little segment of disorder does not exist in Singapore. Singapore's willingness to borrow and adapt from countries ensures they will continue to evolve. They have no problem if something works somewhere else, adapting it to their own system. By the same token, they don't take everything. Well, that's the next point. Their rejection of the theoretical will ensure they remain a pariah. They do, a lot of social theorists put out stuff that says this is the wave of the future and what you're doing wrong. If something works for them, they will not change it. And by the same token, they will not accept something that isn't proven to work or doesn't work in their experience. It will be discarded without question. Now, a number of minority leaders aren't exactly thrilled with Singapore. They think they could do more, and I'm sure there's some justification for that. But Singapore's modus operandi is sink or swim. You're responsible for yourself to a great extent. So, if you're having problems, they put the onus on you. They don't put it on the government or the society. Corporal punishment and execution, they continue to be well supported by the government. Most of the population accepts that. They're safe, they're secure, they can don't have to worry about their cell phones being taken off them in public. They're free to walk around late at night. They're very proud of the fact women can jog the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning and they believe it's because of that corporal punishment, the caning and the execution. Now, free speech and liberties, as guaranteed by the United States, are significantly different. While they do talk about civil liberties, the civil liberties are not as, let's say, all-pervasive as the United States. They have certain rights, but it's not the Bill of Rights that makes up the Constitution of the United States. All right, now an element of presumption comes into the project. We're telling people what to do. We could run the courts and the criminal justice system like a business, streamline the process. Singapore has streamlined their process, and everything is a lot quicker, a lot less lawyer-oriented, a lot less arguing. They have the adversarial system left over from the English system, which is ours is based on too. But they streamline that. They don't want to hear a lot of the flack anymore in these trials. You get to question the witnesses, you get to question your accuser, but you don't get to bring in every sideline that you can think of. You can increase the use of fines for nonviolent offenders. That makes perfect sense. Even low-level drug offenders, you could probably do that here. Work release if unable to pay. You can't. The problem with using fines, and so many people act like they cannot pay, and then they try to get off, or you put it off. I would make them work until they paid it. That's it. So it'd be a form of detention until they could pay. We should still support the use of the death penalty, and that's especially in cases where video evidence or confirmed DNA is present. And we could quicken the appeals process there. A lot of it is unjust people have been accused, and there's been some executed. But when you have video evidence in today's world, confirmed DNA, you're cutting that chance of that happening almost to nothing. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but you really minimize that, especially video evidence and things. Make individuals and families more responsible for criminal penalties. That's so you don't add to the welfare tax burden of the citizens. So many times people have restitution or community service, and it ends up coming out of taxpayers' money. It's really just a shell game they use, and that's not what the purpose is. People have to feel the pain for their crimes. All right, we have to increase the punitive effect of prisons. We have to make it no easy time. Can't be any country club, can't be any gang activity. I know that's unrealistic because we ain't going to clean out the prisons in 10 minutes, and they can't be drug dealing, havens, and gang related. And if they're in the country club aspect, if the person is not serious enough a criminal to be in a prison, then he shouldn't be there. Let them work it off outside. We have to have more comprehensive rehabilitation networks. Prisoners have to be able to get a living job. If they don't, they're going to fall back into the criminal system. If you're making a lot more money dealing drugs than you're going to make on an honest job, most people won't go for the honest job. Next one, most companies, most places, most states, cities, organizations do this. They prepare juveniles through education and vocational training. One thing we could do is increase the quality of that. Singapore's schools in the juvenile detention are supposedly as good as their schools outside. I don't think ours are. We force them into alternative education in Pennsylvania, charter schools, and they're closing down and getting closed down every year. So that's not a fact. Make families of the juvenile feel some degree of responsibility for their child. That's a problem only in that most of the families are on welfare, so they can't be forced to pay for any of the financial upkeep of the child. Well, the child then can work it off, and he'll have to learn that there's a penalty for it. You can't just let people go scot-free. They have to be involved in the process, whether they want to be or not. They have to be involved. And we have to recognize the multicultural dimension of crime. Does one size really fit all? Does every group react the same way to crime? Does every group have the same advantages, and does every group suffer the same disadvantages? You really have to look at individual cases and dynamics of groups, and you can't be afraid of every time being called a racist, because sometimes things are different for different people. and eventually they all end up in the same, but getting there can be very difficult.